Hey everybody, welcome to the third episode of Takeaway. Today's topic is compost. Compost is a cornerstone here in the Acorn Land Lab. I'm Kimball Hildreth with Live Oak, and I'm excited to dive into the nitty-gritty of composting. So I've got a few notes for today's takeaway. Composting is how we prevent the Acorn Land Lab from needing synthetic fertilizer. There are many different issues with synthetic fertilizers. One of the first being that they can burn out the life in the soil. NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizers are often made in countries overseas. They've got a high energy input cost. Takes a lot of non-renewable energy to create NPK fertilizer. When they're brought over, they're very expensive for farmers. When they're applied in excess, they can spill out into rivers and cause algal blooms and create dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and other bodies of water. So they're expensive. They kill life in the soil if applied in excess. They kill life in bodies of water, and they don't promote soil growth. So NPK fertilizers, they have only been used really in great volumes by humanity since World War II. We'll go into the history of NPK fertilizers in another video. It is something it's brand new for humanity, and we're just now starting to see some of the negative impacts and effects. So composting is our answer to giving nutrients back into the soil and building soil rather than depleting soil. Every time you grow food, every time you grow vegetables, fruits, produce, nuts, you're taking nutrients out of the soil, and that's got to be replenished, just like a bank account. If you make a withdrawal from the soil fertility bank, you've got to make a deposit. Rather than buying synthetic fertilizers and spraying those and killing the life in the soil, we compost all of this organic biomass. Food waste, we talked about in the last episode. We take food waste, that's composted, veggie scraps, grass clippings, leaves that fall in autumn. We try not to take too many wood chips because they don't decompose fast enough, but we can take woody biomass and turn it into biochar, which is just charcoal. We crush that up, and then we inoculate it with nutrients by putting it inside of a liquid fertilizer, which we've got a natural liquid fertilizer we make by fermenting green biomass, weeds, kudzu, other types of nitrogen-rich biomass sources. So the biochar is this charcoal that's got all of these nutrients and water that are stuffed in all the pores of the charcoal because it's got all these little cells in it after it's been cooked in the biochar reactor. So those are just a few of the ingredients that go into our compost. A few others that I forgot to mention are shredded cardboard, paper, newspaper. If it is an organic material, it can decompose. Composting is all about decomposition. You take these things that are at the end of their life cycle, whether it's the food scraps, the biochar, old plants and weeds, leaves, grass clippings, and you mix all that together, you keep it moist, and you let it heat up. When it heats up between 130 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, all of those elements are breaking down. They're being broken down by microbes. Microbes are the magic in composting. We take all those materials, leaves, pits, peels, scraps, moldy food, grass, straw, cardboard. We put those in big piles like the piles you see behind me. And we've got them here in the shade. Sunlight can actually inhibit composting. So we've got burlap sacks over the composting piles, and we just use free pallets that we've staked into the ground to delimit our compost zones. So these free pallets create our little areas where we rotate the compost. Because once you've piled up all your materials, you let it sit for a few weeks, you keep it moist, you turn it, and by turning it, we'll move it from one station to another. Composting is an aerobic process. Anaerobic means without air and oxygen. Aerobic involves oxygen and air. You want oxygen and air mixed into your compost. These are rollers that we use to put particularly soupy or icky elements to compost and build up a microbe inoculant that will spread into our other compost piles. So a few things that you don't want to compost. Any kind of chemicals, synthetic chemicals, anything poisonous. Metal, printed paper, printed inks often have toxins, plastic. Those are things that you don't want to compost. There are a few things that you technically can compost, but most people shouldn't. That involves bones, meat, and oil. If you're running a very large-scale composting operation and know what you're doing, you can technically compost those things. We prefer to put those in our biogas digester, feed them to black soldier flies, or use them for other purposes, like making bone meal. Your key composting elements are all going to be biological, and they're going to be able to break down and not create buildups of toxins. The real magic of composting is it builds soil life. Composting is an explosion of life. You've got so many different types of microbes that are alive and active in the compost pile. You'll get different types of insects too. It is like a galaxy of life that is breaking down the food waste, the leaves, using the water to break down the grass clippings. Composting is something that is so complex when it comes to the microbial scale. I can't even begin to explain it to you, but we know that it works because that's how nature functions. The carbon cycle is this closed loop cycle. Speaking of carbon, with compost, you want a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 30:1. So carbon, those are your browns, leaves, dried grass, cardboard, and then your greens are your nitrogens. That's going to be your green grass clippings, your coffee grounds. It's going to be weeds that you might pull and compost. Many different people have many different ratios. You're going to have to experiment with your own ratio of browns to greens, of carbon to nitrogen. Some people recommend a 1:1 ratio of greens to browns because all these elements are not just pure carbon or pure nitrogen. Every element from these pieces of grass here to the wood have different levels of carbon and nitrogen at different ratios. So we'll post some articles that give you more insight into those details. But we take all these elements, grass clippings from the neighbors, leaves from the trees, food waste, shredded cardboard. We make these piles, we put food waste in these rollers, we mix it all up, and then you give it a few weeks to a few months. The microbes do their thing. They'll heat up to about 160 degrees max in our piles. We've got a thermometer which shows us the temperature. And as that compost cooks, it's all breaking down, and we can put that on top of the garden rows to continue building more and more and more soil. Composting is the epitome of a circular system. We grow produce, we cook produce and have veggie scraps. We feed those scraps to the chickens. We then take the chicken manure and put that into the compost. The compost is mixed, it's applied onto our garden, and we grow more food. That is a circular system in action, and composting is a cornerstone. We create much healthier food by composting. Composting has so much more than nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus in it. The compost has got this explosion of various minerals and microbes. Synthetic fertilizer is so reductionist at just NPK. There's so much that's missing, and part of us being willing to be humble and recognize we don't understand everything that goes into making a perfectly healthy vegetable. We've got to recognize the fact that if we just use those synthetic chemicals, we're missing things. We don't know what all those key elements are in compost, but we do know that it creates healthier food. It's far more sustainable. It builds soil rather than eroding soil. And soil erosion is a massive problem on many farms that use synthetic fertilizers only. We're not about to move totally away from synthetic fertilizers, but one thing is sure, we need way more composting going on. It's a great way of making sure you're not sending biological materials to landfills, and it'll give you free, high-quality soil year after year in your garden. Beyond that, this is another topic for another day. Composting reduces and eliminates the need for chemical fertilizers that are purchased overseas. Right now, what we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia is impacting synthetic fertilizer costs, and they're going up. Synthetic fertilizer costs are skyrocketing for many farmers because of international conflict. So yet another reason to compost more. Let's use the biological materials we have here to create the food we need that is healthier, and we're spending less money on synthetic fertilizers, composting instead. Thanks a bunch, everybody.